Hello and welcome to your Lettings Finance training. In this video we are going to be looking at invoices. That will include sales invoices, recurring invoices, purchase invoices including uplifts and commissions, crediting any outstanding invoices, creating credit notes and creating your purchase credit notes. So jumping over into Expert Agent, we're going to start off with our sales invoices. You'll be using a sales invoice in the system whenever you need to create a charge for you as the agent. So as an example, your management fees will be sales invoices, any tenant fees that you're charging, any renewal fees, anything like that where the fee that you're charging to either your landlord or your tenant needs to come to you as the agent, you'll do by way of creating a sales invoice. You can create these sales invoices from either your landlord or your tenancy record, depending on where you're currently working. The process works in a very similar way, but we'll start off with having a look at creating one from the landlord record itself. So searching for my landlord and opening up their record. On their statement tab, we're going to right click and go to your financial submenu. And the second option you'll have from top will be create sales invoice. The first option you'll have within the Create Sales Invoice screen is Assign to Property. If your landlord has multiple properties, all the properties that your landlord is linked to will appear in the drop-down, and it will be a case of selecting the correct property that the invoice you are creating relates to. If your landlord just has the one property, that property will be selected by default, so you won't need to worry about changing that property over. But in the scenario where your landlord has multiple properties, make sure you are always selecting the correct one from the drop-down. You'll notice an additional option at the bottom there, which is landlord only. You would select the landlord only option in the scenario that the invoice you are creating doesn't relate to any of the properties the landlord has. Maybe it's an additional charge you've raised against them for a property you're not managing, or something like that. But in the scenario where the charge you're creating against the landlord doesn't relate to any of their properties, that would be the option where you would select landlord only. So I'm going to select my property on this occasion. The next option we get is description. When we're creating these invoices from the landlord record, the description will default to the landlord name. What you'll want to do is overtype or add to that description to make it something very specific as to the charge that you're creating. If you leave that description as the landlord name, it will be very hard for you to identify the invoice when you're looking back on it for reporting and reconciling. So it's really important that when you're creating your invoices, you're making this description field as descriptive as you possibly can. We've then got invoice number. Your invoice numbers will automatically generate from your configuration, and those will increase sequentially for you one by one, so we don't want to worry about touching that invoice number field at all. Invoice date will default to today's date, so if you need to change that for any reason, you can do using the black calendar icon alongside that invoice date field. We're now adding the specific items to our invoices, so the charge themselves. We can create a one-off bespoke invoice by clicking the Add Item button. Or if we were to click Use Standard Invoice, that will bring up our list of standard invoices from within our configuration section. And I can scroll down the list there, find the invoice I need, and that will populate the item in there for me automatically. So it's a good idea for any fee that you charge on a regular basis to have that invoice set up as a standard invoice within your configuration. For more information on how to set those up, please refer back to the configuration video. With our standard invoices though, they're not set in stone. Just because this is the usual fee I charge, my standard fee for my tenancy renewal, if for this particular landlord on this particular occasion there was a slightly different charge, maybe there was an additional fee we needed to add on to the invoice, we can use the Add Item button and add any additional items on. Adding an item to this charge won't affect my standard invoice. My standard invoice will remain as is within the configuration section. It's just affecting the charge we're creating for this landlord on this occasion. Similarly, if we needed to edit any of the particular items because maybe the fee we're charging has increased or decreased, we can. And my standard invoice will remain as is, it's just this particular charge that we're changing. So even if you're not using your standard invoices as they are, they're a good starting point for creating your charges. Once you're happy, you'll just want to double check the figures at the bottom and then click the Save icon in the bottom right hand corner. You're looking for the green pop-up in the bottom right hand corner to confirm that that invoice is created successfully. And then on our landlord record, we will see the invoice we've just created with the description we gave it. So really important again that we overtype that description when we're creating the invoices, because that's what we'll be seeing here on the landlord statement screen, the description we gave it. If we left that as the landlord name, that would be all we were seeing here. We'll see the invoice number, and our invoice will show as outstanding because we haven't yet marked it as paid. It hasn't been paid, it's just an outstanding charge on the landlord record. And we'll see the amount here. And what we'll see is my balance on my landlord record has adjusted accordingly. So my 340 balance that I had in hand, less my 252 invoice, is giving me my landlord current balance of £88. You'll see alongside every sales invoice that you generate at either landlord or tenancy level that there's always a black downward facing arrow to the left hand side. Clicking that arrow will expand the details of that invoice for you, so you'll be able to see the description of each individual item with the nominal that it was raised against and the net and the VAT breakdown of that particular item. So if you're ever unsure of what this total is, clicking that arrow will give you the full breakdown. We don't generally recommend printing out your sales invoices from the system because full details of those invoices will be shown to the landlord or the tenant on their statement or their remittance. But if you ever needed to send an individual invoice to a landlord or a tenant, you can click the blue print button alongside it. That will take you to your Select a Template screen. And under the Expert Agent Default Letters tab, you'll find a landlord invoice if you're raising it for the landlord, or a tenancy invoice if you're raising it from the tenancy. And you'll be able to click on the letter there, and that will open up a printable version of that sales invoice for you that you can either print or email across to your landlord or tenant from here. You can save and close if you want to save a copy onto the events, or you can just close. If you ever needed to reprint, again, you can just use that print button to reprint that invoice out. So that's creating a sales invoice from a landlord record. We're now going to have a brief look at creating a sales invoice from the tenancy record. So I'm going to close that landlord record down now and instead open up a tenancy. And on the statement tab of my tenancy record, if I do a right click financial, this time create sales invoice is fourth from the top. The screen will look very similar. Charge invoice to this time will be the first option though, so we're selecting who needs to pay the invoice. So should that be split between all the tenants? Is it charged to a particular tenant? Should it be split across all landlords, or should it be charged to a particular landlord? You'll see there are two landlords in my list here. That's because this property has two landlords with a 50-50 split. If I'm just charging the invoice to one of them in particular, I will select that landlord from the list. If, however, I would like my invoice to be split according to the property split, if I select all landlords from the drop down there, Expert Agent will automatically split that invoice for me. Same thing applies to the description. If we're creating the invoice from the tenancy record, we want to ensure that this description field here is as descriptive as possible. It's defaulted to the property address this time rather than the landlord name, but same applies, we want to add to this invoice to make it more descriptive. Invoice number, That's auto generated from our configuration again, so we're not touching that one. And invoice date is defaulted to today, or we can edit it using the calendar if needed. We've got the option to add an item if it's a one-off bespoke charge, or use one of our standard invoices from our configuration. We'll check the details when we're happy, and we'll click the Save icon in the bottom right hand corner. We're waiting for that green pop-up to confirm that the invoice is charged successfully. Because we've charged that to our landlords and we've asked Expert Agent to charge it to all landlords, if I now look at my landlord record and go to the Statement tab, we'll see the invoice there with half the amount. Again, we can use that black drop-down arrow to look at the full breakdown. If I just take you to the other landlord record and look at the same thing, there's the other half there. And the way that invoice gets split relates to our landlord split on our property record. And because I've got 50% there and 50% there, it's split half and half. If I had that set up differently because I needed to, because one was 75 and one was 25, for example, that invoice again would be split accordingly. So those are my one-off sales invoices. We may also have the occasion to set up a recurring sales invoice, so an ongoing fee we need to charge a landlord or a tenant every month, every 6 months, once a year perhaps. We can set those up in Expert Agent as recurring invoices. Again, those can be created either from the landlord or the tenancy record, and those get created in exactly the same way, regardless of the screen you're creating them from. So we'll have a look at setting one up from a tenancy record. The most common reason for using a recurring invoice within Expert Agent would be in terms of a fixed management fee. So rather than charging the landlord a percentage of the rent each month, you're charging them a fixed amount regardless. In that scenario, we would use a recurring invoice. To set that up, the first thing we'd want to do is ensure that our recurring management fee was set to 0%, because we're not taking a percentage each month. And then what we would do is go to the Recurring Invoices tab on the tenancy, click Add a new recurring invoice in the bottom left-hand corner. The screen that opens up will be very similar to creating the one-off sales invoice. We'll have Charge Invoice 2, and we'll have all the same options there to select, so we'll do all landlords. We're entering a description. We're selecting the frequency, so we're telling Expert Agent how regularly we need this to charge. So in this circumstance that will be monthly, but you can select any of the options from the list there. We're selecting the start date, so the first date we want Expert Agent to raise this charge. So in terms of my fixed management fee, that's going to be the first time the rent's due, so the start date of the tenancy. So we'll just assume that's the 22nd. We'll have this ending after option, so we can specify the date we want it to end. We can ask it to end after a certain number of invoices, or in this scenario the option we're going to use is the tenancy end date. So we want this invoice to keep charging monthly until such time that the tenancy ends. If it's a standard fee, again we can use standard invoice, or we can add item if it's a one-off. And we'll save. We'll just check we're happy with the figures, and we'll click Save in the bottom right hand corner. When we save, now on our recurring invoices screen, we'll see the invoice set up there. The payer will be all landlords, confirmation of the property, the description, and this will be the description that will appear on the statement for the landlord each month, how frequently it's set to charge, and when it next becomes due. So that invoice now is set up, and that will charge automatically for me on the 22nd of March, and each month then on the 22nd following until such time that the tenancy ends. The next type of invoice we're going to have a look at is a purchase invoice. So a purchase invoice is the opposite side of your sales invoice. A purchase invoice is a fee that you're charging on behalf of a third party. So these are your disbursements, your third party invoices, predominantly your contractor invoices. So the scenario where a cleaner, for example, has been out to one of your properties, done some work for the landlord, they then brought that invoice into you. You need to get that invoice onto the system so that you can deduct it from the next landlord payment or from funds that the landlord has paid to you directly, and then pay those monies onto the contractor themselves. So where the money doesn't need to come to you as the agent, as your sales invoices do, it needs to go to a third party. In that scenario, you are creating a purchase invoice. As with your sales invoices, they can be generated from either a landlord or a tenancy record. So from your landlord record, you want to go to the Statement tab, and then from your Statement tab, you can right-click Financial and create Purchase Invoice. The main difference with your purchase invoice versus your sales invoice is that you need to assign the contractor. So the money's not coming to you as the agent. You need to tell Expert Agent who that money is going to. So we're going to do that by clicking the Choose button alongside Select the Contractor. We're going to find our contractor in the Quick Find here. If you can't find them, you can add them in using the people with the plus icon in the bottom right hand corner to add them into the system. But assuming they're in the list, you're going to click on them and that will populate them through to the purchase invoice here. And then you're just going to work down the right hand side, filling out all the information required. So as with your sales invoice, you'll have assigned to property, so make sure you're selecting the correct property from the drop down. You'll then have a description. Select the nominal. Invoice number, you'll notice this one is blank because this isn't one of your invoices you're raising as the agent. This is an invoice that you're passing on as a disbursement from the contractor to the landlord or the tenant, but you're just going to pop the number off of the invoice they provided to you in there. Invoice date, again, that's going to be the date off of the invoice. You can change that using the black calendar alongside the date there if the date on the invoice is any different to the date you're adding it. You're then going to enter the net amount of the invoice in, so the net amount off of the contractor invoice. The VAT will automatically calculate from there depending on not whether you have your contractor set up as VAT registered. If I open my contractor record here and go to the Financials tab, you'll see that my contractor is selected as VAT registered and their default VAT rate is set to 20, which means whenever I enter an invoice for them, I'll enter the net amount in. Expert Agent knows they're VAT registered, so it will calculate the VAT and calculate the total for you. We won't need to touch either of these two fields here. If the item we're raising the invoice for happens to have a VAT rate other than standard, you can change it using the drop down. So if it needs to be 0 rated, for example, we can change that over there. The VAT will change and the total will change for us. But for 99.9% of our invoices, they're all going to be at a standard VAT rate for our VAT registered contractors, and that will set as 20 there for us. Once we're happy, we're going to save. And we'll then see on our statement for our landlord is the invoice with the contractor name, the description we gave the invoice and the invoice number there, sat as outstanding, ready to deduct for the next rent when that comes in. If we have a look at our contractor statement as well, we'll see that invoice sat there. Again, the description, the invoice number, the address it was raised for, and the fact it's outstanding. And those funds will become available to pay to the contractor once we've deducted funds from a landlord payment. So that's creating your purchase invoices from the landlord record. You can create them in a similar way from a tenancy record. By right-click Financial, and again create purchase invoice. Exactly the same option on the left-hand side, we're choosing the contractor and populating them in there. This time, because we're creating it from the tenancy and not the landlord, we've got the option to select the payer rather than to select the property. So in creating them from here, we could select all landlords for an example, and that will mean if our property has 2 landlords and they're split to receive 50% of the rent each, we can select all landlords here, and that will mean this invoice will get split 50-50 across those 2 landlords. So if you have any properties with multiple landlords, it's always best practice to raise those invoices from the tenancy rather than one of the landlord records, because those invoices will get split automatically for you if you're selecting the all landlords option. Again, we just enter in all the details there. Confirm the nominal, the contractor invoice number, the date, our invoice net. You'll see with this contractor, that's defaulted to no VAT there with a 0 in there. If I open that contractor record for you and go to their financials tab, you'll see they're not set to be VAT registered. So with your contractors who aren't set to be VAT registered, the VAT rate will always default to no VAT and there'll be a 0 in there for you. But the same rule of thumb applies. You'll enter the net in, and the VAT, which will be 0, and the total, which will be the same as the net, will calculate automatically for you. There's no need to touch those 2 fields there. When you're happy again, you're going to click the save icon. You'll get that pop-up to confirm that that invoice is raised successfully. There'll be nothing on the tenancy statement here because we've charged that to the landlords. With our property 12 Cheney Walk here, we've got 2 landlords on the property, both with a 50% split. So that invoice will have split itself across the 2 landlords accordingly. So if I go to the statement tab of 1 there and scroll down to today's date, we'll see that invoice with the invoice number, and there's half the charge on there, and the other half will sit on the other landlord. You can also raise purchase invoices by quotes if you use the maintenance section of Expert Agent. So if I come into my maintenance dashboard and find my maintenance job in question, on the quotes tab, once my quote's been accepted by the landlord and we've confirmed that they've gone ahead, I'm going to change that quote to accepted and save that there. Expert Agent will ask me if I want to assign this contractor as the job's contractor, so I can select yes. And then that will stay as accepted. Once that invoice comes in from the contractor, because the work's been completed, you can come back to this section and you'll see you've got a raise invoice button in the bottom right hand corner, which you can select. The contractor will pull through for you automatically, so that will be selected on the left hand side. Again, we'll be confirming the payer, so is that a particular landlord or do we want that split across all landlords for the property? The description will pre-populate from the description on the quote, but you can edit that if needed. We'll need to confirm the nominal there. We'll need to pop the invoice number in we've been given from the contractor and confirm the date. We'll again need to put the invoice net in there. And as with before, our contractor is VAT registered, so that's set as standard in there by default. And the VAT will calculate itself there, and we're just checking that the total matches with the total from the quote. When we're happy, we're going to save. We'll get the green pop-up to confirm that that's charged successfully. Our quote is now changed to invoice, and we can change our job to completed. If we jump onto one of those landlord records, and look at the statement tab, what we'll see now is they've been charged for their portion of that maintenance job. There are another couple of options you get when creating your purchase invoices, and those come in the form of uplift and commission. So you have the option when you're passing these charges onto your landlord of uplifting the amount that you're passing on. Now, assuming you've agreed that with the landlord beforehand, you may have the scenario where your contractor's gone out and done the work and they brought in an invoice for £50, for example, and you've agreed that you're going to add on a certain amount or a certain percentage onto that invoice, and the landlord will pay the higher amount. That higher amount will get get deducted, get charged against the landlord in one lump sum. The contractor portion will then go to the contractor for payment, and your uplifted portion will come into your agency payments to pay to yourselves as the agent. So that might be a scenario where you have an uplifted invoice. A commission, on the other hand, is a scenario where you've got an agreement with the contractor that you would charge them a commission for putting the works their way. So they will go out and do that same job and bring the invoice in for £50. You'll add that invoice onto the landlord account, and the landlord will pay that £50. You will then pay the contractor the £50 less a percentage or a fixed commission that you've agreed with them. So they'll get their £50 less £10, for example, and you'll pay them the £40, and the £10 will transfer over into your agency payment section to pay to yourselves as the agent. So we'll have a look at both of those now, and we'll start off with an uplift. So again, we'll go onto our landlord record to look at raising these, but you can raise these in any of the ways we've looked at previously. And again, we'll do our right-click financial, create purchase invoice. We'll choose our contractor. We'll make sure we're assigning the property correctly. We'll enter in our description. We'll confirm our nominal. We'll pop in the invoice number, invoice date, and the invoice net. We'll tick the uplift invoice box. Expert agent will ask you if you're wanting to uplift by a percentage or a fixed amount, so fill that in there accordingly. And it will ask you to confirm the sales nominal. So this is the nominal for the overall invoice that you're charging the landlord. So you might want to set yourself up a nominal specifically for this purpose. We've got one here, repairs arranged by agent, and you can do that in your configuration as a super user. When you're happy with the amount of uplift you've put in and the nominal you've selected, you're going to click the save icon, and that invoice will charge. If we go to the statement for the landlord, we'll see that invoice set on the statement as outstanding. And the amount we're seeing there, 264. If we click the black drop-down arrow, like we can do with all our sales invoices within the system, just to see a full breakdown, we'll see that we've got the net of 220 there. So that was the 200 we entered as the contractor invoice amount, plus our £20 uplift. We are VAT registered as a business, so VAT is applied to the whole net amount, not just the net on the uplift. That's according to HMRC guidelines, where uplifted invoices are no longer classed as disbursements. So you need to make sure, if you're going to be uplifting your invoices, that you're allowing for VAT on the total net amount if you are a VAT registered agent, and not just the VAT on your uplift portion. And that gives us our total of the 264 there. Once that invoice gets marked as paid, so let's just assume that our landlord has paid that 264 to us, we'll record that receipt in and allocate it against our invoice. Okay, so that's now showing as paid. If we go into our top finance menu and come to payments and contractor payments, we'll see our contractor is set there with their £200 to pay, so that's their portion. If we come into our agency payments section, and look for our invoices from today, and there's the £64, so that's our £20 uplift plus the VAT there. So let's just have a look at that from the accounts point of view using our nominal report. So if we go to top finance menu, reporting and nominal report. If we just pick a few nominals to have a look at, so if we have a look at agency invoices, if we have a look at contractor uplift, if we have a look at repairs arranged by agent, which was our overall sales invoice we used, and if we look at the VAT account there, okay, here's the 264, so the total amount that the landlord was charged. Here's the uplift portion only, so there's the £20 we added on. There's the contractor portion only, so there's the £200. We would also see that £200 if we looked at the repairs nominal, so the nominal we used for the original purchase invoice. And there's the £44 for the VAT element there. Okay, let's look at the other side of that now. So let's have a look at the commission. So again, it's a right-click financial, create purchase invoice. We'll choose our contractor again. Again, we're confirming the property, giving a description, selecting our nominal, entering the invoice number, the date, and the amount. And this time we're ticking to charge commission. With your contractors, on their contractor record, you can confirm that they are subject to commission, and you can set a default commission if you wanted. So for example, you could set that to be 10% on there. What that will mean is when you choose them in the list here, and tick the commission tick box, it will default to what you've said on their contractor record. You can always overtype it though, so if you wanted a different amount for this particular invoice, you could. Once you're happy with your selections, you're going to click the save icon. And that invoice will raise, and it will show on the landlord record as before as outstanding there. You'll notice that you're seeing the £50 in there, so that's the contractor amount only. There's nothing added onto the landlord. The landlords are just paying that contractor portion there. And your commission will come off of the contractor payment when you go to pay them. So if again we just mark that invoice as paid by confirming that the landlord has made that £50 payment to us. There we go. We now go to look finance payments, contractor payments. Our contractor will be sat there with their balance. If we click to edit the payment, we'll see the commission sat there. So that's £30 for us, so it's the 50% of the £50 there, which will be 25 plus VAT on that because we are VAT registered, gives us a 30. If we need to see that in more detail, we can go onto the contractor record itself, go to the statement tab. There's the commission invoice. If we click the downward arrow alongside it, we can see the net 25 there and the VAT 5 giving the 30 total. So the 50 less the 30 gives the £20 to pay to the contractor. They've already got the 200 balance to pay to them from our Uplift invoice example as well. So if we were to deselect those and pay the contractor there, we'll cover this in more detail in the payments video, but you can then run a remittance for that contractor payment. And that remittance will detail the invoices you're paying to the contractor and any commissions that are being deducted. So next up, we're going to have a look at creating credit notes for sales invoices. You'll use the credit and outstanding invoice function if you've charged a sales invoice to either a landlord or a tenant, and then at a later date you realise that perhaps that invoice shouldn't have been charged, or maybe you agree with the landlord or the tenant that they're no longer liable to pay the invoice. In that scenario, you might want to credit the invoice off. So we'll look at crediting an invoice for our landlord, but if we're crediting the invoice from the tenancy, it works in exactly the same way. So if we right-click Financial, you'll have the option Credit an Outstanding Invoice. And what that will do for you is it will open up a screen that will show you details of all the sales invoices you've charged to either that landlord or the tenant that haven't yet been marked as paid, so your outstanding sales invoices. You'll tick alongside the invoice in question. Expert Agent will automatically assign that creditor number. You'll be able to select the date if it needs to be different than today, and you'll click the save icon. and that will raise that credit for you, so it will automatically credit it and adjust the landlord balance accordingly. So rather than that 252 now showing as outstanding, the original invoice, the original charge is now showing as paid, and it's got a corresponding credit note. And we'll see there that my landlord balance has adjusted. That option only works if the invoice is fully outstanding. If you need to create a partial credit, or perhaps credit some money back to the landlord or the tenant after you've already marked their invoice as paid, after you've already deducted it from a landlord payment, for example, in that scenario we would create a credit note. The way we do that is right-click Financial, create a credit note, and the function is very much the same as an invoice. We're filling in exactly the same information, except this time rather than creating a charge, we're creating a credit for them. So we assign the property, we enter a description, the credit note number is automatically assigned, the credit note date, again we can change that one if we need to. We're more than likely going to want to use the add item because it's probably a one-off. We select the nominal, we'll enter in our amount and we'll save. Check we're happy with the details and we'll click the save icon in the bottom right hand corner. Again we'll get the green pop-up, and if I just refresh my screen there, we'll see the credit note showing of £30, and again you'll see my balance available to pay to my landlord has now increased by that 30. So in terms of crediting outstanding invoices and creating credit notes, we're using the credit an outstanding invoice function if we're crediting off the full invoice. Expert Agent will then automatically create a corresponding credit against the sales invoice that was initially charged. If we're wanting to create a partial credit, or credit something once it's already been deducted from the landlord or from the tenant, we're using the credit note function to create that credit ourselves. The last type of credit we're going to have a look at is crediting a purchase invoice. So because this particular type of credit doesn't relate to one of our invoices, it relates to a contractor invoice, it's going to work in a slightly different way. But again, it's via the right-click Financial submenu there, and it's create a purchase credit note. This screen will list for you any of your contractor invoices that can be credited. So you'll select the invoice in question. You can change the date of the credit if it's to be any other date than today, and you'll click the save icon. And then on the landlord record, you'll see the credit there listed. The original contractor invoice will then show as paid in brackets, and the landlord balance will adjust accordingly. If we were to look at the contractor record, on their statement tab, the same will apply. Their initial invoice will show as paid, and you'll see the credit, and their balance will adjust accordingly. That's the last section for this video. Thank you for taking the time to watch.